1 Thessalonians 2 is where our study will be from this morning. So I encourage you to open your Bible to that place, and once you've done that, you might just put it to the side for a little bit. It's going to take us a long time to get there, but that's eventually where we'll be studying from this morning. I try in my preaching and in just our regular interaction together to tell you, at least periodically, that I love you. And I hope that even if I don't say that, maybe I show it to you in some way. But even if I don't do that as often as I would like or as often as I should, I hope that you know that. And what I want to do this morning is maybe expound upon that a little bit in a slightly unusual way, perhaps. And I want to start with an illustration from my baseball days. And so you sports enthusiasts may identify with this. On a baseball field, the catcher, the hind catcher, as some of you old timers might still say, is the captain of the field. He's the one who gives signals to all of the other defenders on the field. Right fielder, you need to shift over 3 steps. Shortstop, you need to move to your right a little bit. Why is it that the catcher is the one who tells people where to go sometimes, who talks about defensive plays? And yes, there are plays in baseball. If you don't know anything about that, I'd be glad to educate you sometime on that. Why is it that the catcher is the one who does that? There's lots of reasons. Number one, the catcher is the only player on the field who sees everything. His back is not to anybody except the umpire. He can see, standing from one spot, every position on the field. Reason number 2. There are 2 people on a baseball field who are involved every pitch of the game. The pitcher and the catcher. Those 2 touch the ball every pitch unless it's hit. Think about that, right? Now, the catcher, what does he do with the pitcher? Well, obviously he catches the pitch. But what else is he doing? He's doing this, right? He's down here and he's giving signals, right? He's telling, throw the fastball, all right? Throw the curveball, throw the slider here. What gives him the right to call the pitches? 2 things. Number 1, he knows the pitcher better than anybody else. He knows what the pitcher's best pitch is. He knows what his worst pitch is, too. He knows what the pitcher is good at and what he's not so good at. And so he calls pitches according to the pitcher's strengths. But here's the second thing the catcher knows. He knows the batter. And he knows his strengths and weaknesses too. And the catcher can remember things like this. You know, in the 3rd inning, there were 2 outs and there was a runner on second base. And the batter was behind in the count, and I called for a changeup, and we threw the changeup, and he caught it, and he drove a double into right center. I'm not going to call that pitch again. He remembers things like that. Nobody else does. Why? Because nobody else is involved every single pitch of the game, the way the catcher and the pitcher are. Incidentally, I was a pitcher, by the way. The pitcher and the catcher are usually the 2 smartest guys on the field. Why am I talking about all this? What in the world does that have to do with the Bible or preaching or anything else? Long before COVID, As I am wont to do, I pulled out my yellow legal pad and I started jotting down some notes for a sermon. And what I wanted to do with this sermon that I just put on the shelf all this time because of a number of different factors, but I held on to these notes. I got to thinking one day about, I wonder if people out there ever wonder, what is it like to be up here? Now, many of you have preached a sermon or 2 or 12 or 10,000 in your life. But most of the people sitting in here have not. At least 50% of you, by virtue of the fact that you're female, have never done this and never will. And most of the men have not done this either. Do you ever wonder, what's it like to be up there preaching a sermon? Maybe you've thought about that before. If you've done it before, what was it like for you? You're probably thankful that we have a pulpit that's 6 feet wide so nobody can see your knees knocking together up here. But when you've done this as many times as I've done it, the nervousness kind of subsides over time. It never actually completely goes away, you might be interested to know. But you get better at handling it, at least. And so when you become pretty seasoned at this, you stand up here in the position of the catcher. Not in the sense of a captain. Please don't carry my illustration to that conclusion. I'm not suggesting I'm the captain of the church, okay? But think about this. At this moment, I'm the only person in the building who can see everybody in the building. What do I see up here? You ever thought about that before? You ever wondered, what does Ben see while he's up there preaching? What does Joe see while he's up there preaching? I wonder if he ever sees people texting. Yeah, I do. Think I ever see people sleeping? Yeah, that's happened a few times. Although that happens more when Joe preaches. But what does the preacher see when he's up here? Well, there's a lot of things that I see. And I don't just mean the bad things like people texting or people sleeping. So what I want to do for a few moments this morning is kind of pull back the curtain and let you have the vision that I have while I'm up here preaching. And so this is just a list of things that I jotted down, a full page. Things that I see while I'm up here. These are things that I notice while I am preaching. Things that my mind wanders to while I am preaching. And they say men can't multitask. And usually that's true. But again, you do this long enough, there are some things that you're able to do simultaneously. So what do I see? Well, let me start off with some very simple things. Most of the time when I am up here preaching and I look out among you and I see you, I see joyful worshipers who are thankful to be here. And that does my heart a lot of good. Because sometimes I see disengaged worshipers who don't seem to be very joyful. Maybe they were a joyful worshiper last Sunday, but they're not today. You see, I noticed that. That tells me something. Sometimes I see people who are not joyful worshipers at all. In fact, there may be reluctant, hesitant worshipers, or maybe they're worshipers who they don't even want to be here at all. Maybe they were forced to be here, or they were compelled for some other reason. But I will tell you, thankfully, that's the minority. I see smiling faces when I'm up here. except for those of you who have your masks on, but I'm gonna think, at least tell myself, you're smiling behind it. I know you are at this moment, because all of my jokes are tops. But you know, sometimes I see long faces up here. I see people who are sad. And again, maybe they weren't that way last week. Something's happened. My heart goes out to Ron this morning. Ron is a smiling face every week. Brenda too. I'm thankful to see Ron this morning. But I understand Ron may not be smiling today as he normally does. I see young babies and young children when I'm up here preaching. Joe mentioned in Bible class, we have some 60 children in this congregation. And when I see that, that fills my heart with so much joy and thankfulness. Because I don't just see people when I see those children. I see opportunities. I see blessings from God. I see families that are growing, hearts that are being filled because of these souls and these children that God has given. I see these children. Sometimes, though, admittedly, I hear them first. But there are no greater sounds in a church building than the sounds of babies. And I know I've said that to you before, but if you are a young parent and you have a baby that's being a little restless and a little bit loud, that's okay. That's a wonderful sound to hear. I see a whole row of teenagers sitting over here. And as I'm preaching and I see those teenagers, I think back to when I was a teenager. Guys, I know your challenges. I know the things you're dealing with. It wasn't all that long ago I dealt with them myself. And if you asked your parents about those challenges, they would tell you the same thing. It wasn't all that long ago that we were dealing with them ourselves. I'm really proud of our teenagers. I'll mention Michael just because he led our singing this morning. Isn't he doing a tremendous job? How do people become great worship leaders in adulthood? It's because they start when they're young. Adults who grow up to be great servants of the Lord, whether they are worship leaders or not, in whatever capacity they serve, most often it starts when they're young. That training begins when they're young. I see a lot of young parents when I preach. And oftentimes the looks on their faces, I know those looks. I make them myself every day. And I know the struggles of these young parents who are exhausted, who are wondering every Sunday, is it worth all of this effort to wake the kids up in the morning, get them out of bed and get them dressed and showered and ready and comb their hair? And oh my word, the combing of the hair. At my house, I don't even do it. I have no right to complain about it. My precious wife does it. It takes 6 hours. We get up at 4 a.m. just to start doing braids. And you get here after all of that effort, and the worship is going on, or the preacher is up and preaching, and parents, I can just see it on your faces. You can't hear a thing. Your babies are restless, or screaming and hungry and milk, and I want this, and give me that, and colors and pages, and oh no, I threw up in the pew. And you get up with them, and you go out, and you calm them down, and you bring them back in, only to do it 6 more times. And I can see on your face the look that says, is it even worth it? Yes, it is worth it. It's worth it because one day your babies won't be babies. You see, they'll be grown and they'll have babies of their own, and they'll be going through the same struggles, and they'll say, you know what? I'm going to do this because my mom did it for me. And my dad did it for me. And I'm all that much better for it. I see middle-aged people who have innumerable responsibilities. You've got kids who are growing up in school and they're facing things that you never had to deal with in school. And you've got life insurance and health insurance and deductibles and what happens if Junior breaks his arm at ball practice. And you've got dance recital or whatever it is, piano recital that you're going to. You've got all kinds of stuff going on, and you've got bills and a mortgage and retirement and all these things that you're worried about. Am I saving enough? Am I doing enough? How in the world are my kids ever going to afford to go to college? How can I pay for this? How can I? What can I? When can I? Anxiety? Much? You see, I see that up here. I see aged saints, oftentimes weak and infirm with chronic pains and problems. And yet, still here. Every time the doors are open, still here. And when I see feeble sister so-and-so come walking through the front door of the church building, and you can tell with every step that she takes that she's in pain. And yet Sunday is the highlight of her week. And when I see brother so-and-so who's standing up in the back because his back pain just won't allow him to sit down for very long. And yet there's nowhere else he'd rather be. I see these aged saints. I don't just see body aches and AARP. I see libraries of wisdom. Oftentimes, untapped wisdom. And they would love nothing more for a young person to come up and say, I need some advice. What do I see from up here? I see people who are growing strong in the Lord. Some of you are growing at a rate that astounds me. You text me and you call me or you email me or you pull me aside and, hey, I want to ask you a question. I need help with understanding this passage. Can you talk to me about this passage? You're growing like weeds. God bless you for that. But when I stand up here, sometimes I see people who are not growing. I see people who are stagnant. I see people who need to be encouraged to greater heights. What do I see from up here? Sometimes I see people who are hurting. I see people who are dealing with addictions. Some of you have talked to me about those. Some of you haven't. But if statistics teach us anything, I know that they're out there. And believe it or not, even if you haven't said anything to me about it, I know the signs. I know what to look for. There are people who are dealing with things like pornography addiction, alcohol addiction. Folks, there's no shame in that. I don't say this to embarrass you. But what I see is people who need help. And what our elders see is people who need help. And that's at least one reason that we've asked Brother Adams to come, to talk to us about some of these things, to help give us some guidance about how best to help you and equip so we can overcome these things. I see people who are in recovery, people who are trying to turn the corner. And I know that that feels like you're pushing a 1,000-pound lead ball up a mountain. But you're trying. And you can't quit. You can't give up. But I see that. I know you're struggling. I know you're fighting with every ounce of fight that you've got. But you can't quit. I see marriages in trouble. I look out and I see people whose marriage is struggling. But I also see marriages who have gotten to the other side of those struggles. I see people who are worried about their wayward children. I see people who are worried about troubles of family members. I see people who are worried about their own health, their own finances, their job security, and other such things. All of this, I can see it on your faces. Sometimes when I'm preaching, I see empty seats. And I know the body that's supposed to be in that seat. And maybe they're not here today because they're sick. Maybe they're not here today because they chose not to be here. What do I see when I'm up here? I see a larger group than I saw 4 years ago. God has blessed us tremendously in that regard. And I see a peaceful and a united group. And that does my heart a lot of good. Up here, like the catcher on the baseball field, I can see everything. Every face, every child, every senior. I can see quite a bit. Why are these the kinds of things that I see? It's a very simple reason. Because preaching is about people. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul started in verse 1 like this. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition. Paul says, I don't want our preaching among you to have been in vain. Our coming to you was not in vain. What does he mean by that? I think what he is saying is, we want you to succeed spiritually. We want you to be strong. We want you to do well. We want you to thrive, not just make it, but really thrive. And Paul says, we came to Thessalonica and we preached, And when we were preaching to you, there were people there who opposed us at every corner because they didn't like what we were saying. You can go back to Acts 17 and read about it. But even in that opposition, Paul says, you believed. You didn't let that deter you. And so our coming to you was not in vain. But how can I, as a preacher, do everything possible to make sure that my work among you is not in vain? It's not wasted. Now, understand that at some level, the greater responsibility is on you. But what can I do to help? Paul answers that right here in this text. First, he says, a preacher's motivations must be right. Look at verse 3. For our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or deceit. Notice how he starts. What's the basis for our exhortation and our message? He says, first, let me tell you three things that it's not. We're not coming presenting error. We're preaching truth. And, God willing, that's what Joe and I do every time we stand before you. We have no desire to ever say anything to you that's wrong. Secondly, he says it does not come from impurity. That is, our motives in preaching are pure and whole and righteous and good. And our motivation is not deceitful. We're not trying to trick anybody. We're not trying to fleece anyone, take advantage of anybody, as so many are wont to do. That's not why we do this. But rather, our motivation, verse 4, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak. Not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. Now, Paul's talking about the apostles here, okay? In no sense have I been approved by God, at least not in the same way that Paul was. I'm only approved by God insofar as I handle his word correctly. 2 Timothy 2:15 would say that. But as a preacher of the gospel, God has given us this message, and I have taken this message, and Joe has taken this message, and we have said, we want to share this with people. And we want to do it from good motives, not from evil ones. We're not out to please people. We're out to please God. And so may our preaching first and always be faithful to him and what he wants us to say. But may our preaching also never be from error or impurity or deceit. Because we want our preaching to be helpful, to be instructive, to be encouraging to you. We preach not for money or for fame. Verse 5, we never came to you with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. Paul says, I'm not in this for the money. If he was in it for the money, he made a really bad choice of occupation. In some passages in the New Testament, Paul would talk about how at times he was destitute and he had nothing. People who preach because they love money and they want more, once they get to destitution and poverty, they quit. We're not in this for that reason. Verse 6, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others. We are not in this, folks, to receive accolades and applause and have you pat us on our back and tell us how great we are. We value your appreciation and your encouragement. But we're not in this because we need 200 people stroking our egos. We preach because we love people. We preach because we want you to succeed in every aspect of your life, but most of all spiritually. In verse 7, Paul says, "But we proved to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children." That expression in verse 7 has come to mean more to me as a young parent who has 4 young children. And having seen the way that my wife tends to our young children and the wonderful way that she does that, this passage has taken on a more significant meaning to me. But Paul says that's how we, as your teachers, behave towards you. We tried to be that nursing mother, that tender mother towards you as we were helping you grow. In verse 8, he says, "Having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our very own lives, because you had become very dear to us." Can I latch onto that last expression? You had become very dear to us. I say that about each of you. Every one of you is very dear to me. Some of you I know better than others. Some of you I am more deeply acquainted with than others. And some of that is just by virtue of the fact of age or demographic or whatever. But every one of you is important to me. And I'm speaking for Joe as I say everything this morning. I know he would agree with these things too. Your spiritual well-being is of great concern for me. I think about you so often. I pray for you so often. We who preach, notice Paul says there's 2 things in verse 8. Look at the verse again. He says, we were well pleased to impart to you 2 things. He says, not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives. It is a tremendous privilege for me to impart the gospel, to teach the Bible to you. And you, God bless you, give me an opportunity to do that every week in some capacity, whether it's in a Bible class or in a sermon. When I said God bless you a moment ago, I didn't mean that in the Southern way, like bless your heart. That's not what I meant. All right, y'all are Southerners. You know what I'm talking about. I mean it in this sense. You come to this place every week to worship knowing that me or Joe, one of us, is going to stand up here and teach you from the Word of God, commanding your time and your attention. And you give it to us. God bless you for doing that. And may we never abuse that or disregard that or take that lightly. We get to impart the gospel to you. And what an amazing privilege and responsibility that is. But he says we also impart our very lives to you. You see, what that means is that we hope to be more than just teachers of the word. We also want to be sources of influence and relationship and encouragement and inspiration and hope and etc. We want to be your friends. We want to be people that you feel like you can come to when you have questions or doubts or problems. I got a phone call just a few days ago from one of you asking me about some doubts that you were having in your life. Thank God I got a phone call like that. That's what I want. It's not a bother or a nuisance to call me. I want those phone calls. Why? Why do I want those folks? Because preaching is a people business. It's not a business, but humor me. This is a people kind of a work. Verse 10. You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behave towards you believers. Just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children. Paul talks about mothers in verse 7, those tender mothers caring for their children. And in verse 11, he talks about fathers who exhort, encourage, and implore their children. Parents, mothers, and fathers, both roles in the design of God, which is a perfect design, both roles are absolutely essential and necessary. And sometimes where the mother's tender touch is needed, she's there to give it. But there are other times when maybe a firmer hand is needed, and maybe dad can come along. And I'm not saying women can't be firm and dads can't be tender. You understand that? But I'm saying balance is needed. You know, parents, sometimes we have to do a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, right? You know, sometimes we need both, and we kind of have to approach it from different angles. But I love Paul's image here. Parents love their children. They would do anything for their children. And Paul says that's how we feel about you as teachers of the word. So when I stand up here, I don't just see my notes. In fact, my notes these are kind of useless. Frankly, it's an old ratty piece of paper now. But I see so much. And what I see are people who, what I want for you more than anything else is in verse 12. That you would walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. That's what I want for you. Every one of you. And there are times when the sermon is over and I've been surveying and I'm thinking about specific people whom I noticed while I was preaching and what their needs are, what their struggles are, what kind of encouragement they need. It takes everything I can do to focus on the words of the invitation song because I've got so much in my mind. And I'm trying to make a mental list of everybody I need to check on this week because of what I saw from up here. Sometimes when we sing that invitation song, I come right down here and all of you stand and we all begin singing together, and I'm thinking about all of these things. Just wishing that so-and-so would come forward. Hoping that this person who just can't quite pull the trigger on obeying the gospel would just come forward and do it already. Thinking about the struggles and the challenges that I saw from up here. That's what it's like to stand up here. I'll close the way I opened this morning. I do love you in a tremendous kind of a way. And I hope that you know, and again, Joe says the same thing. He feels all these same things. You can come and talk to us about anything. And you may think your story is unique and that we've never heard anything like your story before, and you're wrong. We've heard some wild stories, I promise you. No matter how wild and crazy your story may be, though, even if your story really does top everything that I've ever heard, I would receive you warmly and compassionately because I care for you. You've become very dear to us, Paul said. So thank you. If I can help you in some way, if our shepherds can help you in some way by praying for you, counseling with you, if you have a broken life, you can bring it to the Lord Jesus and he can help you. And we want you to do that even this morning. Please come now while we stand and sing.